Welcome to a new deep dive brought to you by Safety One Source. Today we're really zeroing in on an area that's critical for safety professionals, risk managers, and, well, anyone committed to building a stronger safety foundation.
That's right. We're talking about OSHA's updated general industry walking working surfaces and personal protective equipment standards.
Specifically the fall protection systems part. That's 29 CFR Part 1910, subparts D and I for those keeping score at home.
And to really get the full picture, we're not just looking at the text of the regulations themselves. We're also diving into two really important letters of interpretation from OSHA.
Okay.
One clarifies some questions from the International Safety Equipment Association, ICEA, and the other tackles questions from the National Association of Tower Erectors, or CNATE. These give us direct insight from OSHA.
Yeah, those LOIs are often where the real practical application comes out. So our mission today is pretty straightforward. Let's unpack these documents. We want to pull out the key information, especially around training and fall protection.
Yeah, absolutely. The goal is to give you the safety-focused professional listening in clear, actionable knowledge. Stuff you can use right away to boost safety in your workplace.
Okay, so where should we start? Maybe the foundation? Training for fall hazards?
Perfect place to start. The core requirement is right there in OSHA 1910.30a. It basically says, before any employee gets exposed to a fall hazard, they need thorough training.
Okay.
This is specifically aimed at those using personal fall protection systems or, where training's required elsewhere in the rules.
And there was an initial deadline for that, wasn't there?
There was. It was May 17th, 2017. So this has been in effect for a while now.
And it's not just any training, right? I remember seeing something about who needs to conduct it.
Exactly. Section 1910.30a2 is very clear.
Right.
This training must be conducted by a qualified person.
The qualified person.
Yeah.
We'll definitely need to circle back to what OSHA means by that, especially with those LOI insights you mentioned.
We will. It's
Right.
a key definition. But the point here is OSHA expects real expertise delivering this training.
Makes sense. So what specifically does this fall hazard training need to include?
Well, 1910.30a3 lays it out pretty nicely. It gives a detailed list. It's not just like a quick safety chat.
Right. Let's break that down. What's first on the list?
First, employees need to really understand the specific fall hazards they might face in their own work areas, and just as importantly, how to actually recognize them.
So it's context specific, not just general falls, but their potential falls.
Precisely. It's about spotting those red flags in their day-to-day work.
Okay. What's next?
Second, the training has to cover the procedures your company has established to minimize those hazards. So it connects the hazard recognition to the actual safety plan, how you expect them to work safely.
The how-to of staying safe within the system. Got it. Number 3.
Third one is critical for anyone using personal fall protection systems. The training must cover the correct procedures for installing the systems, inspecting them meticulously, operating them properly, maintaining them, and even how to safely disassemble them when needed.
Wow, the whole life cycle of the gear.
The whole thing. It's not just about clipping in.
All right. And the final piece of this fall hazard training.
And finally, it has to cover the correct use of the personal fall protection systems and the equipment itself. This gets into the nitty-gritty, proper hookup, choosing the right anchor points, correct tie-off techniques, all that.
And inspection and storage too, right? Based on manufacturer.
Absolutely. Can't forget that. Inspection and storage, according to the manufacturer specs, are non-negotiable for keeping that gear working right.
Okay, so that covers fall hazard training in detail. But the rules also mention specific training for certain types of equipment covered under these subparts.
They do. That's OSHA 1910.30b. This section outlines training needed for various pieces of equipment. And similar to the fall hazard training, the initial deadline was back on May 17th, 2017.
And the focus here is?
The focus is on proper care, good inspection habits, safe storage, and critically, the safe use of the equipment before an employee actually uses it.
Okay, so what kind of equipment are we talking about specifically?
Well, the standard calls out a few examples. First, employees using balkboards.
Common issue.
Very common. They need training on proper placement and, crucially, how to secure them so they don't shift unexpectedly. You can imagine the risks on a busy loading dock.
Absolutely. Stability is everything there. What else?
Then there's rope descent systems, or RDS. Anyone using those needs specific training on proper rigging and safe use, and this has to follow the detailed rules laid out in Section 1910.27, which is the section dedicated just to RDS.
Right, a specialized piece of equipment needs specialized training. Makes sense. And one more.
Yes, the standard also mentions designated areas used for fall protection.
Okay.
If your company uses a designated area as part of its fall plan, then employees working within that area need training on how to set it up correctly and, just as important, how to use it properly so it actually provides the protection it's supposed to.
So initial training is comprehensive, but safety changes, workplaces change. What about retraining?
Good point. OSHA addresses that directly in 1910.3 UC. It's definitely not a one-and-done situation. Employers must provide retraining whenever they have reason to believe an employee doesn't quite have the understanding or the skill needed anymore.
So it's triggered by a perceived gap in knowledge or skill.
Exactly. And it's about maintaining safety, not pointing fingers.
What kind of situations trigger this mandatory retraining?
The standard gives clear examples. First, if there are changes in the workplace that make the old training obsolete or just not enough anymore.
Like a new process or new machinery.
Yeah, or even a different building layout, maybe new fall hazards pop up. If the work environment changes significantly, the training needs to catch up.
Okay, logical. What's another trigger?
Second, if the types of fall protection systems or equipment change, maybe you upgrade your harnesses or introduce a new type of self-retracting lifeline, someone trained on the old gear might not be automatically competent with the new stuff. So retraining is needed.
Right, different equipment, different procedures potentially. And the last trigger. Seems like an important one for supervisors.
It really is. Retraining is also required if there are, quote, inadequacies in an employee's knowledge or use of fall protection systems or equipment.
Meaning if you see someone doing something wrong.
Precisely. Or if it just becomes clear they don't really understand the why or the how behind the procedures, that's a big red flag that retraining is necessary to get them back on track, before an incident happens.
Okay. And there's one more piece to this training puzzle. In 1910.30, something about understanding.
Yes, absolutely crucial. The standard explicitly says training must be provided in a manner that the employee understands.
So language barriers, learning styles, that all needs to be considered.
Exactly. It's not enough to just deliver the information. You have to make sure it's actually received and understood. Otherwise, the training isn't effective.
Right, that lays out the core training requirements pretty clearly. Now let's get into those letters of interpretation you mentioned. They often add so much practical color to the regulations. Let's start with the one OSHA sent to IZEA, equipment folks.
Right. So IZEA had a couple of pretty technical questions based on the final rule. The first one was about the gate strength requirement for snap hooks and carabiners. The rule in section 1910.140C8 specifies 3,600 pounds minimum strength.
Okay.
And IZEA noted this was slightly different wording than the ANSI standard they usually work with, ANSIAS Z359.11 2009.
And their concern was?
Their concern was that OSHA's wording could be read as meaning you had to test the gate strength on every single snap hook and carabiner.
Oh, wow. Like individually test each one.
Yeah. And they rightly pointed out that doing that kind of test repeatedly could actually damage the gate mechanism, make it unsafe.
Yeah, testing it to near its limit could weaken it? That doesn't seem right.
How did OSHA respond? OSHA clarified things very helpfully. They stated flat out that no, they did not intend to require testing every single connector gate. Their intent was always to align with that ANSI standard.
Okay, good.
And to make it crystal clear, OSHA said they plan to issue a technical amendment to the rule. It would clarify the gate needs to withstand that 3,600-pound load without the gate separating from the nose or body by more than 0.125 inches, consistent with ANSI.
That's a really practical clarification. Avoids unnecessary testing and potential damage. Good. What was IZEA's second question?
The second question hits on something we touched on earlier, the definition of that qualified person who's supposed to conduct the training.
Right.
IZEA noted that the construction fall protection standard uses the term competent person for similar training roles, and they also referenced the ANSI Z359.2 standard on fall protection programs. They wanted clarity on how these terms relate, especially for trainers.
This is a big one for anyone managing safety programs. How does OSHA define qualified person in this context?
So OSHA's definition, which is in section 1910.21b, defines a qualified person as someone who, and this is key, through a recognized degree or a certification, professional standing, or maybe just extensive knowledge, training, and experience, has demonstrated the ability to solve or resolve problems related to the subject matter, like fall protection in this case. It's about proven ability.
Proven competence.
Yeah.
So IZEA asks specifically if someone who meets the ANSI standard for a fall protection trainer, and is also a designated competent person under ANSI, would meet OSHA's qualified person definition for general industry training?
Yes, that was the core question. And OSHA's answer was essentially yes.
Interesting.
They confirmed that generally speaking, an individual meeting those robust ANSI requirements would likely satisfy OSHA's definition of a qualified person for training.
Even though the terms are slightly different between general industry and construction competent.
Right. OSHA acknowledged the different terms, but emphasized the underlying expectation is the same: expertise and competence in the subject. They pointed out that even the competent person in construction who does training needs to be qualified in their knowledge.
Did OSHA look specifically at what those ANSI standards require?
They did. They mentioned that ANSI Z359.2 requires trainers to really understand fall hazards, the rules, the equipment, deep knowledge. And they also pointed to ANSI Z490.1, which guides qualifications for safety trainers, emphasizing subject matter expertise, training experience, technical know-how.
Okay.
And then they connected it to the responsibilities of a competent person under Z359.2. Things like identifying hazards, developing procedures, verifying equipment suitability, and importantly, verifying that the training actually worked.
So the takeaway for safety pros listening, if your trainer meets those ANSI Z359.2 and Z490.1 requirements for both a trainer and a competent person,
then OSHA generally sees that level of expertise as meeting their qualified person standard for delivering this training under the general industry rules.
that's really helpful. Provides a solid benchmark for ensuring quality training.
Exactly. It connects the dots between OSHA's requirements and established industry best practices, helps create consistency.
Okay, let's switch gears now to the other letter of interpretation, the one OSHA sent to NATE, the National Association of Tower Erectors. Their questions seem very industry specific.
They are. NATE represents workers often dealing with unique high-angle environments. Their first big concern was about that initial training deadline.
The May 2017 one.
Yes. They felt the original 6-month window wasn't enough, especially for employers doing antenna work on, say, commercial building roofs. They asked for an extension.
Until November 2017, I think. Did they get it?
They did ask for that, but no, OSHA denied the request for a further extension.
Why not?
OSHA's reasoning was basically this. NATE employers were already subject to training requirements under both the telecommunications standard and the construction fall protection standard.
So they should have had comparable training programs in place already.
That was OSHA's view. They felt the requirements in those existing standards were largely equivalent to the new general industry rule. So most NATE workers should have already received adequate training.
And OSHA had mentioned that in the rules preamble, right? That existing compliant training was sufficient.
Exactly. They reiterated that point. And they felt the initial 6-month period was enough time for companies to cover any remaining workers who might have needed supplemental training to fully meet the new general industry specifics.
Okay. NATE also asked for more time to do fall hazard analyses before having to provide the actual fall protection gear and train on it. What was OSHA's take on that?
OSHA denied that request too.
Okay.
Their point was that the fundamental duty to provide fall protection in general industry wasn't new. It dates back to 1971. Plus, they felt NATE employers were already familiar with the flexible, performance-based approach to fall protection from the construction standard, so analyzing hazards and implementing solutions shouldn't require extra time under the very similar general industry rule.
All right. Another big one for NATE seemed to be about fixed ladders, specifically the deadline for adding fall protection to ladders over 24 feet.
Yes, they were worried about the November 19th, 2018 deadline, thinking it might be too soon for some companies.
How did OSHA respond to that concern?
OSHA clarified a really important distinction. They reminded NATE that the old rule already required cages or wells on fixed ladders over 20 feet.
Okay, right.
So the November 2018 deadline was just for adding some form of acceptable fall protection. That could still be a cage or a well, or it could be a personal fall arrest system, PFAS, or a ladder safety system.
So it wasn't mandating immediate replacement of cages with ladder safety systems by 2018?
Exactly. That deadline, the one requiring only ladder safety systems or PFAS on existing caged weld ladders, that's much further out. November 18th, 2036.
2036. Okay, that's a huge difference. That clarification probably eased a lot of minds.
I imagine so. It makes the 2018 deadline much more about ensuring some protection is in place, leveraging existing systems where possible initially.
What about rope descent systems? NATE works at significant heights. Did they ask for an exemption from the 300-foot height limit for RDS?
They did inquire about a possible blanket exemption for the telecom tower industry. OSHA said no to a blanket exemption. However, they pointed back to the exception already written into the rule. You can use RDS above 300 feet if other ways to access the work area aren't feasible, or if using those other methods would actually be more hazardous.
So no free pass, but there's flexibility for specific, justifiable situations.
Precisely. It's assessed on a case-by-case basis based on feasibility and risk.
Okay. Anchorage strength came up too, right? The 5,000-pound requirement. Nate had a suggestion.
Yes. The rule requires anchorages for personal fall arrest systems to hold 5,000 pounds per employee attached. Nate wondered if a lower threshold, maybe 1,000 pounds, could be used just for travel restraint or fall restraint systems, not fall arrest.
And OSHA's response.
OSHA stuck with the 5,000-pound minimum for fall arrest anchorages, but they highlighted the performance-based option again, which allows anchorages to be designed, installed, and used under a qualified person's supervision as part of a complete system, as long as it maintains a safety factor of at least 2.
So engineering and qualified oversight can provide an alternative path, but the baseline for fall arrest remains 5,000 pounds unless that alternative is met.
Correct. It allows for flexibility through qualified design, but keeps a high default standard for life-saving equipment.
Nate also touched on connector testing. Similar to ISA, they wanted alignment with an ANSI standard?
Yes. They recommended aligning with ANSI Z359.1 2007 regarding proof testing connector gates.
And OSHA's reaction.
Similar to their response to ISA, OSHA agreed. They stated again their plan to issue a technical amendment to make the rule consistent with the ANSI standard on this point, clarifying that proof testing every single gate isn't required by the manufacturers.
Good to see that consistency and responsiveness to industry standards again. Now, Nate apparently disagreed with the rule's limited exemption for fall protection during brief inspections.
That's right. The rule allows for brief pre- or post-work inspections or assessments without requiring fall protection if installing it would take longer or be more hazardous than the inspection itself. Nate felt everyone should follow the same rules all the time.
Why did OSHA include that exemption?
OSHA explained it was mainly for consistency with the construction standard, which has a similar provision. They also mentioned that many commenters during rulemaking argued that forcing fall protection setup for a, say, 5-minute visual check could actually increase overall exposure time to hazards.
I see the logic, though it's a fine line. And it doesn't apply if fall protection is already set up, right?
Absolutely not. It's a very narrow exemption only for situations where fall protection isn't already readily available or in place.
Okay, last point from the Nate letter, the trigger height. Nate wanted the general industry 4-foot trigger raised to 6 feet, like in construction.
They did suggest that, aiming for consistency.
But OSHA
said no. They stood firm on the 4-foot trigger height for general industry.
What was their reasoning?
They pointed to its long history. It actually goes back to a 1932 ANSI standard, and it's used in other current OSHA standards too. Fundamentally, OSHA stated they just haven't seen evidence proving that raising the trigger height to 6 feet in general industry would provide equivalent or better protection for workers compared to the established 4-foot level.
So the 4-foot rule stays for general industry. That's definitive.
Yeah.
Wow, okay. This has been incredibly detailed. A real deep dive into the updated standards and those critical LOIs. Let's try to summarize the key takeaways for everyone listening, especially our audience focused on safety through Safety OneSource.
Definitely. We've covered the core training requirements for fall hazards and specific equipment, underscoring the need for qualified trainers and making sure the training is truly understood by every single employee.
And that definition of a qualified person got much clearer thanks to OSHA's response to Isaiah, showing how it aligns well with those established ANSI standards for competent persons and trainers. That's a big help for verifying credentials.
Absolutely. And from the Nate letter, we got important context on OSHA's thinking behind deadlines for training and equipment.
Right.
The specific nuances around fixed ladder compliance dates, remember 2018 versus 2036. The conditional exception for RDS height limits, the anchorage strength options, the upcoming clarification on connector testing align with ANSI.
The rationale for that limited inspection exemption, and of course, the firm stance on keeping the 4-foot fall protection trigger in general industry.
It's a lot, but it highlights how dynamic these regulations can be and how important clarification is. And it really reinforces the need to stay current. For everyone listening, we absolutely recommend using OSHA's official resources. They have detailed information on these walking working surface rules right on their website.
Yeah, checking OSHA.gov directly is always the best bet for the latest official word. So as we wrap up this deep dive, Here's something for you to think about. How can this deeper understanding of OSHA's fall protection standards, the training specifics, and these clarifications be proactively put to work inside your own organization?
Right, how can you use this to foster an even stronger safety environment and ensure you're maintaining compliance?
And specifically, think about how those clarifications on qualified persons impact your trainer selection or development, and how the equipment specifics affect your current protocols.
It's all about taking this knowledge from our discussion today, presented by Safety One Source, and actively applying it to strengthen that culture of safety for everyone on your team.
Thanks for tuning in.